In this lecture, we will go over the basics of operant conditioning. Operant conditioning, or OC, is one of the most intuitive theories that is covered in this class and that is used in public health research. This theory proposes that a person's behavior is influenced by the consequences that that person experiences after engaging in that behavior. This is a very, very old theory. It originates from the separate works of Pavlov, Thorndike, Watson, and Skinner. So these are big names in psychological research that you'll hear associated with this theory. There are a number of other terms that are used for operant conditioning or in conjunction with operant conditioning, including operant learning, Skinnerian models, behavior modification, experimental or applied behavioral analysis. When we talk about operant conditioning, we're talking all about the consequences that occur after a behavior. In this theory, the consequences are divided into two categories: reinforcement consequences and punishment consequences. Reinforcers are consequences that are supposed to increase the occurrence or the frequency of a behavior, or in other words, these reinforcing consequences are supposed to make the person want to do that behavior again. So an example would be we're trying to increase the frequency of exercising. So we would design a reinforcement strategy that could motivate the person to continue exercising once they've started. In contrast, punishment is designed to decrease the frequency of a behavior. It's supposed to make people want to avoid repeating that behavior. So an example would be if we're trying to decrease the frequency that a person smokes, we may use a punishment consequence. The tricky part about operant conditioning is that both the reinforcement and punishment consequences can be either positive or negative. Positive consequences are those that add something. Now, the tricky part about this and what people get confused about when we're talking about positive consequences is that just because the word positive is in the name doesn't mean it's a good thing. It doesn't mean that we're adding something good. And we'll go over an example of this in the next slide. So in contrast, a negative consequence, so a negative punishment or negative reinforcer, is when you take away something. And again, just because this is called negative doesn't mean that it's a bad thing. So let's pair the negative and positive aspect with the reinforcement and punishment consequences, and we'll be able to see what we mean. So the first example is positive punishment. An example would be giving a child a spanking when they act out. This is considered positive because we are adding something. So this is the classic example of why these terms are tricky and why students get confused. Positive here just means we're adding something. Of course, a spanking can never be viewed by the child as something positive. It just means they're getting something. And it's punishment because it is designed to decrease the behavior. So we've added a spanking in order to decrease the bad behavior. And I've put a little note here on the slide just to remind you that this is where people get the most confused, is these words positive and negative don't actually mean good and bad. They mean adding and subtracting. So think about them more in mathematical terms. Moving on to negative punishment. An example is taking a child's allowance away when they act out. So this time we are removing something. The consequence is the removal of something. And in this case, it's the removal of allowance or money. But because it's punishment, it serves the same purpose of trying to decrease the behavior. Moving on to reinforcement. The first example is positive reinforcement. The example is paying a diabetic patient $1 every time they check their blood sugar. This is positive because we are adding something, we are giving them $1, but it's reinforcement, a reinforcing consequence, because we are trying to increase the behavior. So this time we're trying to get people to do it more as opposed to punishment when we're trying to get them to engage in the behavior less. The final example is negative reinforcement. The example is lowering health insurance premium rates when a person uses the gym regularly. So it's negative because we're taking away something, we're taking away that insurance premium, that fee, and we're trying to increase the behavior. So we're trying to increase gym use. This is just a 2x2 table that you can use to help you remember the types of consequences. So on the columns, we have the consequences, we have positive and negative. And on the rows, we have the way that we're trying to change the behavior, whether we're trying to increase it or decrease it. So it's noted here on this 2x2 table that positive reinforcement is what we classically think of as the reward. This is what people most often want. They want to get something for engaging in a behavior.